Okay, everyone, welcome to the last of our SNARL seminars. And I'll just make a few announcements while people are still jumping on here. Just wanted to let you all know that we will be running our programs this summer at Valentine Camp. So we have programs for kids, our outdoor science education programs, and we do still have some spaces open in those if you know any young ones that are interested in spending some time at Valentine learning about nature this summer. They're fantastic programs. We also are doing our tours, our walking tours of Valentine this summer. And you can find out more information about the tours on our website if you just go to the Education Outreach tab on our website. We have tours throughout the summer and they're focused on various things ranging from the history of Valentine to wildflowers, to bears, to geology, some really cool stuff. So it's a great chance to get out to the site, walk around and listen to some people with some expertise in these areas, tell you all that they know about Valentine. So this is the last of our SNARL seminars, and I am so pleased at how well this has gone this year. So I really thank those of you who've been tuning in every week to these seminars. It's been really fun, and I've learned a ton, not just about Zoom, but about all kinds of things. So it's been really great. And today, last but not least, we wanted to end on a bang. So this is one that I've been looking forward to for the entire 7 weeks. And as a sort of a different twist, this last seminar, we have not just one, but two folks presenting tonight. And I'll give you a little background on both of them here shortly. First of all, Naomi Tague is a professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, and that's the school at UCSB that focuses on all kinds of topics ranging from natural resources to management. And she has been working on looking at modeling and looking at forest ecology and trying to understand a little bit more about how the complexity in these forest ecosystems interacts in a very tightly coupled way, and how humans are changing these systems in ways that we need to understand if we're going to manage these forests better. Her research uses advanced data science techniques to understand how water, plants, geology, and climate interact in this tightly coupled system, and how humans are changing this system. Much of her work involves designing advanced simulation models that integrate data from multiple sources, including field and lab experiments, and data from remote sensing technologies. And so this is certainly something that's of interest to many of us here in Mammoth Lakes as we head into what is looking like an exceptionally dry year and dry summer. The topic of fire is on everyone's mind. And so really understanding how our forests are going to persist in the future in the face of climate change is a really important issue. And the second person I'd like to introduce tonight is Ethan Turpin. And what's really cool, I think, about Naomi and Ethan is they form this collaboration through science and art to really tackle a problem that is difficult and complex, and it's hard for people to visualize what is happening. When you feed data into a model, you get these results, and oftentimes model results are not the most intuitive things for people to grasp unless they can sort of use some of their other senses to try to understand this. So I'm a big fan of these science and art collaborations, and I think this is such a cool one. And Ethan is our artist. He's an independent video producer and media artist. His documentaries and immersive exhibits have been shown in film festivals, museums internationally, spanning topics such as water quality and wildlife. And originally, I found out about their project, and I'm sure they will both talk a little bit about this project called Future Mountain, and really hope that we can get them here in person to present the project here, because it sounds amazing, and it sounds like something that's maybe not quite as easy to capture over a Zoom screen. So we're really hoping we can get Naomi and Ethan up to SNARL next year and bring the Future Mountain with them. So the title of their talk tonight is Interactions Among Fire, Water, Climate, Carbon, and People in Sierra Nevada Forests, Tackling the Complexity Using Models. So thanks, Naomi and Ethan, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks, Carol, for that introduction. You gave such a good introduction. I feel like I could skip the first half of my talk, but I'll say a few things anyway. So, you know, Mediterranean type ecosystems are those places where all the water comes in the winter, often as snow, and then you have droughts in the summer. That may sound familiar to you because we in California live in one of those Mediterranean type ecosystems. And these types of ecosystems, for a lot of reasons, partly because they already have summer drought, are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And make no doubt, climate change is happening in these systems. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's something that we see already. And you're probably familiar with that. This is a graph showing deviation in mean annual temperature. Blue would show where things were colder than normal, red when they're warmer than normal for the Sage Hen Creek watershed, which is just a bit north for you, in Lake Tahoe, and you can see that things indeed are getting warmer. And this happens in Mediterranean type forests all over the world, and it's leading to things like increased forest mortality. And people have studied that. But what you'll notice is that a lot of those impacts happen in places like the Western US, the actual Mediterranean basin in Europe and in Australia. And I work in all of those different environments. And for all of them, they have impacts of climate change that we are sadly very familiar with, right? We're seeing increased fire severity. We're seeing increased forest mortality. We're seeing changes in forest productivity. We're seeing changes in water resources, right? Increased floods, increased droughts. And in that situation, you know, we as scientists are faced with some important questions, right? Which are basically, what will our forests and our water resources look like in the next decade? And what can we do? Are there things, what role can management and mitigation play in this situation where we're getting more mortality and fire and floods and less of the things we want, like carbon sequestration and water in the summer? And I've looked at this for a long time, and I think one of the things that becomes really clear is that to answer these questions, we have to think about this as a coupled system. And by that I mean, if you change the vegetation, whether through fuels treatments or whether because a fire goes through, that will affect water, right? Because trees use a lot of water. But it's not a one-way interaction, right? How much water you have on the landscape affects the recovery of vegetation from fire, how vulnerable vegetation is to fire. And so all of these things really interact with each other in the context of a changing climate, which, as we know, humans are contributing to, but also how these things interact really varies across landscapes, right? Depending on what aspect you're, are you in a north-facing slope or a south-facing slope? Are you at a high elevation, a low elevation? Also with things that we can't see, like what's going on in the subsurface, right? So my sense is the right tools for answering those questions are things that pull together all the information we can find. And some of that information comes from intensive experiments and field study, the kinds of things that we do at places like the Valentine Reserve and SNARL, right? And then making use of big data, remote sensing observations. But to put those together, you have to make sense of them. And that's really where I come in, and that's where models come in. Models really integrate these types of data and learning and try to make sense of them and be able to make predictions about where things are going to go in the future. So really what I'm doing is I work at taking things like what we learn from remote sensing data, from NASA products that tell us a lot about, for example, how snow is changing in the Sierras. And increasingly, networks of observatories that we see all across the US and the world. I work with observatories in Israel, in Spain, in Australia, where we try to really understand how these things work. And I try to put them together with what we call process-based models. Now, you might be going, well, okay, what is a process-based model, right? And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you hard questions about this equation, but just to give you a sense of what we mean by process-based models, we use mathematics to describe what we understand about mechanisms. This is the Penman-Monteith equation, which kind of gives us a mechanistic representation of how evaporation from needles or leaves occur, that account for things like how windy it is at the surface of the leaf, how much radiation you have, what the plant is doing, opening and closing its stomata to keep water, right? And we have many of these equations for all the different processes that might, or not all, but many of the processes that might be important for understanding how things like water and carbon and energy and fire and even people interact on the landscape in a way that's very dynamic, that accounts for the fact that you have precipitation coming in, you have snow melt, but you also have a forest that's growing or dying as a result of mortality, or burning and recovering as a result of fire. And we typically model that using a carbon cycle, because forests, a good way to, a sort of simple way to think about forests is as really nice little carbon cycling processing plants. So I've spent much of my career developing these types of models, which if you're a computer geek, you should know these are tens of thousands of lines of code. They take hours to run, but they really embed a lot of this information, right? So what I want to talk to you about today is really give you some examples of how we use these models to really think about our forests in environments like the Sierras to understand how climate change is affecting them. But to show you that we learned some really interesting things, but it's really hard, like Carol said, to communicate that information, right? And that's what led me to work with Ethan, because I was really trying to find a way that I could make what we're learning from our models understandable and salient to different people. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now going through some examples of some of the scenarios that we've run with these models and what we've learned. And at the end, talk about some of our ways, particularly using Future Mountain, that we've been trying to use to communicate those results. But let me start by kind of giving you kind of the science behind the visualization. So I'm going to talk about three different things. When you thin a forest, and by thin I mean a fuels management, or some way where you're taking out biomass, largely to try to reduce fire severity. Or when that happens naturally, when you get background forest mortality. Do we get more water? And then asking questions about what happens with drought and warmer temperatures? What happens to fire? Are they going to get larger? And then finally, when we put those things together and we thin a forest, what does this mean for fire severity and water and carbon, right? So let's start by thinking about what happens when you take biomass out of a forest. Do you get more water? And it's true that if you take a lot of biomass out, you do get more water. And people have studied this for many decades in hydrology, where they've gone all over the world and they've looked at places where you remove forest cover, and we sort of show that we get an increase in water yield. You know, these graphs all have lines that kind of slope upwards, but there's a lot of scatter. And most of these studies also happened in places where they removed a lot of forest. These are the old days when we actually used to go out and clear cut forests. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about changes in water yield that are associated with thinning or background forest mortality. And this is a really hard thing to monitor, right? It's a hard thing to do experiments with, but the few experiments that are out there show changes in water yield that are all over the place. And in fact, we've spent some time reviewing those studies, and what we've learned from these field experiments and field studies is that it's not quite so simple. Because when you remove biomass, forest biomass, you should indeed, you reduce the transpiration from the biomass that you've removed. But there's a lot of things that might happen in response. It's a very water limited environment, these Mediterranean type systems. So the other trees might use that water, right? Or you've opened up the canopy, you're letting in more solar radiation, you might increase transpiration and evaporation from the understory. You might change the snow melt, right? So, and then these things change over time. You go in and you do a field treatment, the forest doesn't stay static. It recovers over time. You might get species change, right? You might change fire regimes. So if we want to look at the long-term impacts on water yield, we need the types of models that I'm talking about where we can say, all right, how do these compensating mechanisms play out, right? What are big numbers? What are little numbers? How much additional evaporation do you get? To what extent do the remaining trees get that water that you've made available by removing biomass? And how does that change over time? So our model is specifically designed to answer those questions, partly because we model different forest patches over space. We can account for water moving around on the landscape. So we can account for the fact that, say, a riparian zone gets more water. We account for the fact that north and south facing slopes get different amounts of solar radiation, right? And we model all those processes like snow melt and soil evaporation and understory and overstory interactions, and how these change over time as forests regrow back, right? And we do this at kind of hill slope scales, but we also look at fine scales where we can look at, well, what happens when you change the shading between different trees, right? Or to what extent do neighboring trees share water? And we can do model experiments to see how important that's likely to be. Now, before I show you results from doing those types of experiments, I feel it's important for me to at least try to convince you that our model works. And we spend a lot of time as scientists evaluating our model by comparing our model predictions of stream flow against measured data. We compare our model estimates of things like evaporation with flux tower data, with flux towers, which measure that. We compare it with remote sensing patterns. We compare it with tree rings. Happy to send you lots of papers on our model validation, but just to kind of give you some confidence. So one of the things we did is we applied our model to a mixed conifer forest, kind of mid-elevation in the Sierras, right, the southern Sierras, kind of above Fresno, if you're familiar with that. And because we have a model, we can do experiments that you can't do easily in reality. Think of it as a virtual laboratory. And what we can do is we can do a field treatment or a forest thinning in every year of a historic climate record. This shows a mean annual precipitation deviation. So really since 1943 and 2010, what years were wetter than normal, what years were drier. And we can do a thinning in every year in that historic record, and then let the forest regrow for the next 10 years and see what happens. We can also vary whether that thinning happened on a deep soil or a shallow soil. We can vary the amount of biomass that we take out. And importantly, we can vary what we assume about how connected neighboring trees are, because that's something we as ecologists don't know very much about, right? We don't know how lateral root networks work. And so here's what we find from our little model playground, if you will, right? So these graphs show how long it's been since, how many years since you did the thinning, and whether you're in a deep, a kind of moderate or shallow soil, right? And what we're showing here is the change in total water use by the forest. If you're below this gray line, since you've thinned, you're using less water. If you're above it, you're using more water. These are box plots. They show the range of variation in our estimate due to climate, due to just the randomness of, did you thin in a dry year and then get a wet year after it? Like how much climate variation is there? And then the difference between the blue and the orange is what we assume about how connected the root structures are of those trees. If they're blue, they're well connected. If they're orange, they're kind of independent. And all I really want you to take away from this is how much water the forest ends up using after thinning. First of all, it changes over time. It's very different depending on these subsurface things, how well connected the roots are, whether you're in deep or shallow soils, right? And in fact, sometimes by thinning, eventually 10 years later, because of the growth that you've stimulated, you actually might be using more water than you were using before. This is a lot of information to communicate, right? This is partly where I started working with Ethan. And in our initial foray, we just thought about, well, what are some pictures that we could use to communicate some of these contingencies in terms of how much water yield you've got. So Ethan drew these watercolors that really are actually a summary of this graph. What they show is whether the soils are deep or shallow, how well connected the roots are, and how that affects water yield, right? So this was kind of our first foray into thinking about how do we use art to communicate some of these complicated results. So let's turn now to fire, right? And one of the things we do in this model framework, this RHESSys model that I've been talking to you about, is we model fire, right? And we model fire in this kind of stochastic way where we randomly start fires all over the landscape, and then we kind of use what the model knows about how dry the fuels are, how much biomass there is, to model how quickly and easily that fire spreads, and how severe the results are, how much biomass gets burned. Are there ladder fuels that allow the fire to go up and burn the larger canopy, or does it just burn through the understory? And we estimate that. Just like with the hydrology that I've shown you, we've tried to validate our model. It's a little harder for many reasons to validate fire models. We can talk about that at some point. But what we do is run it for places. This actually shows some fire modeling results for the water supply catchment for Santa Fe. And we run it kind of randomly throwing ignitions over time and see, well, if we get the probability of a particular part of the watershed burning, how consistent is that with what we see from like tree rings, historical tree rings in those watersheds that tell us something about burn frequencies? And we kind of think we get things right because we burn at the right time of the year. You know, we get the fire season right. And we also show that most of the fires occur in these mid elevations, which is consistent with tree rings. So it's not a perfect validation, but it tells us we're getting something right. And then we can use this model to say, in a Southern Sierra watershed, right? And we have a warming climate or we have more droughts. How is that going to affect fire regimes? And are the effects going to vary with things like vegetation and aspect and slope? How are these things going to impact the way in which a changing climate will impact fire? So again, we do this by doing model experiments, by playing around in our model playground, if you will. So what we do is we take our historic record and then we say, well, what if we take the droughts that we had in the 2010s that you probably all remember? Well, what if we repeat those for multiple years, right? And then what if we say, what if those droughts had been a little bit warmer, just 2 degrees warmer, 4 degrees warmer, right? And we generate a bunch of kind of artificial climate scenarios that help us understand how fire regimes in this watershed might change if climate changes in different ways, because we don't know exactly what the climate's going to like in the next decades, right? But we want to know, well, we're going to have more droughts or it's going to be warmer. How will that affect fire? So here's what we get. So what I'm graphing here is the mean annual area burned, averaged over 10 years. So remember, we can't tell when a fire is going to start, right? It's too random for us, right? So we just kind of run random ignitions, and then we kind of calculate over 10 years, what's the average area burned given those random ignitions, right? And we're using a baseline climate period to drive this. But then remember, we're creating these scenarios where we're imagining that this last 50 years actually had a bunch of droughts that look like the 2010 drought. Or what, and those are all shown in these kind of pink colors. Or if they were warmer, right? We add 2 degrees to this historic climate record, or 4 degrees to this historic climate record. And then, so what we see are how this mean annual area burn changes. Now, what you might note is that initially we have higher mean annual area burns. And really that's an effect of when we spin our model up with, if you will, we don't turn on fire. So it's kind of like having fire suppression. So initially, for all of our climate scenarios, you get more area burned because you've had suppression up until that point, which is very much like what we see in California, right? We have higher area burns because we've had decades of fire suppression, and the model sort of plays that out. And in the drought scenarios, these red, pink, and pink ones, we do see more area burned. Not surprisingly, more drought, more area burned, right? But what is kind of surprising is if those droughts are warmer, we actually see less area burned. And that becomes even more obvious as we return our fire regimes, right? Going forward, we have some of these big fires that takes out vegetation. So going forward, we kind of move to a new equilibrium of these repeated fires. But we get more area burned, kind of higher fire severity in droughts, but warmer temperatures really don't increase the area burned. And that might seem surprising, especially when we go to like 4 degrees of warming. And we've just published this work, and our reason for this is simply that while droughts and warmer temperatures do increase fuel aridity, what they also do is reduce the rate at which things grow back. If things get drier, things like ladder fuels just don't come back as quickly after a fire, right? So you get this interesting thing that the model allows you to play out where you have contrasting controls on fire, right? And we've been doing a lot of work in different places. We just published a new piece doing a similar type of thing in Idaho. And we really show that within watersheds, where that threshold is of where a particular type of climate scenario will increase fire severity or decrease really depends on the location and the type of vegetation you have, right? So the answer to what's going to happen with a warmer climate is not so simple, right? Because warmer, drier climates in a place like the Western US also affect the growth of forest, right? And the recovery of forests after things like fuel treatments or fire, right? But on the other hand, they increase fire weather. We can do the same type of experiment with models. Again, that we've spent decades kind of integrating both like remote sensing data to shape some of the inputs to these models and what we learn from these field experiments. We can start to ask, well, how about fuel treatments? Do they have this same kind of contingency? We do a fuel treatment. How important is the climate we get after the fuel treatment, or the elevation, or the slope, or the aspect, even within the same watershed, right? How will that affect the results of the fuel treatment on things we care about? And remember, fuel treatments, I say fuel treatments because we're often doing them to reduce fire severity, but you might do a thinning of a forest for other reasons, right? Thinking about changes in carbon and changes in water, right? All of these things. We don't just care about fire, right? Our forests provide many services, right? So how do they respond to fuel treatments? So one of the ways we can kind of use models to do this experiment of how important are these different factors in influencing what happens when you do a fuel treatment, right? So in this recent paper here, we did an experiment where we were again looking at this kind of mid-elevation mixed conifer site in the Southern Sierras. And we ran scenarios where we varied the treatment in method and intensity, where we were doing understory thinning or removing overstory trees, whether we added prescribed fire, how often we did it, and then site characteristics, right? What was the kind of shrub versus conifer mix? Were you on a north or south facing aspect? How dry were your, how deep were your soils, right? Were you in a wet period or a dry period? Did we think about climate warming, right? How close were the trees to one another? How much root sharing was there? And what we can do then is, you know, for those of you that hate things like these crazy graphs with probability distributions, but what we're doing here is saying for all, we run thousands of scenarios varying all of these things. And then we can say, well, what does that mean for the change in stand carbon, or forest growth and productivity, or forest water use, or fire spread probability, or things like the gap between understory and overstory, which we know are really related to fire severity. And you know, many of these things go in the way that you would expect. If you remove vegetation, you do reduce evaporation, but not always. Just like I showed in those earlier graphs, there's some scenarios where you actually increase evapotranspiration because you've stimulated regrowth, right? The point here is really that there is a lot of variation in the responses. Even if the mean response is kind of the effect that you would expect, there's a lot of variation. And that's important, right? Because if someone goes out and does a field treatment, well, their field treatment is just one point on this probability distribution. It could be anywhere. It may be more likely to be in a place where your productivity is increased, but it might be one that goes over here. And we have to help people understand that what happens after a field treatment is going to vary with what kind of weather you get for the next 10 years, what your soils were like, how that vegetation regrows, right? And so even if on average it's going to give you a particular effect, we have to help people think about the place-based and kind of opportune, just it happened that these sets of characteristics and these conditions came together to give you your effect. And these models help to bound those conditions. They help to tell us what the probability distributions are going to look like. And that can be really helpful for managers, right? But they also help place things into context, right? And we can do things like use, Carol said that I'm an expert, you know, in data science techniques. And so, of course, I get to use all these new machine learning techniques to analyze model output to kind of say, well, what are the most important sources of variability and rank them? We find like treatment, how you do the treatment and its intensity are the most important factors. But things like soil depth are, you know, ranked third, which means what's going to happen is going to vary a lot with what your soil depth is. And that's something we often know very little about, right? So there's also, doing these types of analysis also helps us guide future field research. It helps identify what are the things that if we knew more about, we could do a better job of thinking about what our forests are going to look like in the future, right? So these are the kinds of things we've been doing, right? And as you can see, the answer to all of our questions is it depends, right? It depends on the weather you get. It depends on this hidden subsurface, right? What's happening with the roots, what's happening with the soil. It depends on where you are in the watershed. It depends on how these different mechanisms that we're slowly gaining understanding of, how they play out over space and time. And really, I have found, you know, communicating this complexity is one of the big challenges that we face. And that's really, again, why I started working with Ethan. And so what we've come to is we've worked together, and also with David Gordon, who's has worked a lot with computer gaming to build interactive ways to interact with the model, ways for the public and people to get in and play with the model, to do the kinds of things that I'm doing, but to show it in a way that's a little more meaningful. And this is Future Mountain. We have, if you watch here, this is a clip of Future Mountain, and you can see we show these different cubes. These cubes are different stands that are in different places in the watershed. Here we're showing things you usually can't see, like evaporation. You can see that it's moving over time, it's snowing, and then it will melt, right? And the user can kind of move in and out, coming close to the cube, but also see how that cube sits in space, right? And we find people are really engaged by this. We allow them to change the temperature to add those warming scenarios. We allow them to move through time day by day, week by week. And you can sort of follow along here to see where you are in time, and can kind of watch how it's playing out. These guys are interacting with it. If you keep watching, you'll actually see a fire. Now, I have to say, please be aware that, you know, this is our first version of this. We appreciate the fire looks a little weird. This is our first version. And we were really excited. We presented it at a gallery space in downtown Santa Barbara. And we learned a lot about things that we want to change, right? So I'm just giving you a bit of a preview. But by doing things like comparing our cubes, right? Here, this is, we stopped the model at a particular point in time, and we can see what happens if we warm things up at that particular point in time. Now there's no snow, right? We can use side-by-side cubes to see how spatial patterns of fire are going to change as things get warm, right? One of the things we've also been doing and is combining this with other work that Ethan does on giving people the experience of fire. So you have this kind of very sciencey kind of visualization, interactive tool that you get to play with. But we also have Walk into Wildfire, which Ethan can tell you more about, but which really gives you an experience of what it's like to be in a fire. And we find combining those things together really help bring people into this world, right? And then we also use it for training and education, even of graduate students, right? It helps them get a sense of what's going on, right? So, you know, this is where we are. And I think what we're really interested in is moving forward. This was really our first version of Future Mountain, and we'd like to continue to evolve it, partly because we learn from every time we've shown Future Mountain, we've learned, oh, we should show it this way. We'd like to bring it together with some of the stuff I showed you earlier, where we were looking at the watercolors, right? Different ways of really bringing the black box of these models to the public, to other scientists, even to graduate students and students. So we're always evolving our designs, right? And then of course, we work with people at SNARL, like places like SNARL, to integrate their science into RHESSys, the kind of hardcore science engine of this, right? So it really is this kind of constantly evolving cycle. And we're really excited to talk at SNARL because we haven't really worked at SNARL, and we'd love to find ways to engage there. And then Ethan and I have learned a lot in this process. We're now working on a book that talks much more about our art science engagement and what works and what doesn't. But our goal is to really try to reveal more about what's hidden. What are the things about these environments that you don't see that science can bring to you? But we have to have ways of really making that meaningful and salient for people. So with that, of course, this kind of stuff, this kind of research involves a whole team, right? And I've just put up some of them here, but there's many, many people involved in this, and you know, I'm always grateful more for my students and my team than I am for anything else. Okay, so I'm going to end it there, and we look forward to questions. Ethan is here too, and can answer questions as well. So we're open for questions.
All right, thanks, Naomi. I certainly have things, but I want to let our audience ask questions. And I see Jeff Dozier has his hand up. So Jeff, I am going to allow you to talk.
Oh, you're talking rather than, I get it. I was looking for something in the chat, but I didn't see it. Okay, Jeff, hey.
Hey, so that was a really insightful talk, and I really appreciated it. I'm glad I introduced you to Carol.
I am too.
Great.
So,
thanks, Jeff.
So the question and this is similar to what I asked Lewis on his PhD exam. In trying to incorporate the changes in temperature, to what sort of processes does the temperature in fact affect? You know, for example, the rain-snow transition, but other kinds of processes are mainly related to the processes that cause the temperature to rise. For example, changes in atmospheric emissivity, and therefore at the same temperature, you might get more long-wave radiation because of the additional CO2, for example. To what extent do you try to decouple those processes, or is temperature sort of used in a more empirical way?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jeff. And you know, it would be great to run, you know, a fully coupled, you know, sort of local atmospheric model with a model like RHESSys, and we just can't do that at this point. Like the complexity of doing that is just kind of beyond us, I think. You know, so we try to get around it in different ways, right? That are probably, you know, I think maybe we get the first order controls. You know, I mean, we're looking at the way temperature affects, you know, vapor pressure, you know, vapor pressure deficits, which obviously derive something like evapotranspiration. We account for things like increased CO2 concentration, and it's a, you know, there's a certain amount of increased water use efficiency that happens because we have higher concentrations of CO2, right? Like that actually does help your plants to some extent. So there's some of those things, but you know, they're really exogenous in the model at this point. So that is one of the limitations.
Okay, thank you. I realized I just raised my hand by accident, so it was just a probability that I got called on first. But go ahead with the other questions, Carol.
All right, thanks, Jeff. If anyone also has a question they would prefer to ask by raising their hand, that's fine. I'll just let you speak, or you can type your question into the question and answer box. And if no one else has a question, I'm just going to ask my question right now, which is kind of to both of you, Naomi and Ethan, really, because as we've seen, there's been a real explosion of interest, shall we say, by the policymakers in the state of California and in the West recently in these issues, you know, forest management, of climate change. And to what extent do you think, you know, your ability to communicate these model results to these people that are kind of in that policy world, you know, is that kind of one of the big goals of doing these visualizations, is to really try to reach out to those folks and to give them a sense of, you know, what's important in terms of how these model results could impact the kinds of decisions they're making?
Maybe I can start, and then Ethan, I think, will have a perspective on what I'm going to say. You know, there's different communities, right? Policymakers want synthesis documents, and they kind of want, you know, they want simple answers. And part of our work is to communicate how you make decisions under uncertainty, right? And we try to put that by, you know, they may not need something like Future Mountain, right? They just need to learn about, well, here's the highly improbable scenario that's really going to kill you, but here's what we think is most likely to happen. And then, you know, kind of work on how, you know, if you're managing a reservoir, all right, like how risk adverse are you? I mean, there's ways that we talk to policymakers that are probably a little bit different, but policymakers have to respond to the public. And I think, you know, especially some of this contingency complexity, if we don't help the public understand that, I think it creates doubt, or it creates like a distance between them and what these policymakers are trying to do. Even if the policymakers are trying to do like the best decision making under uncertainty, if you don't start communicating this to people, I think it affects the policymakers. I don't know, Ethan, you may have a different perspective.
Yeah, well, I guess for me, I come at it in terms of hoping that really no matter who you are, you have plenty of ways into the experience. And I find that we've been pretty successful in that with the broad set of exhibits and experiences that we've provided. You know, everywhere from literally, you know, 5-year-olds to their PhD grandparents have a lot to kind of chew on in these experiences. And that's partly because it's so data rich, or, you know, there's just so much going on. There's so many, you know, from a basic, like, I get to explore a virtual forest, to really getting into all the processes and their relationships to each other, and ways of manipulating them to experiment with those scenarios. And there's so much that's emergent within it. We actually love putting it in front of people of all sorts, because they may find things that not many other people have found, or that that wasn't even super obvious in the data, depending on how you were looking at the data. So like by doing visualization and simulation, it opens it up to new ways of perceiving what's happening. So to get at the, you know, how that relates to lawmakers, I often will be in exhibits with people and they'll say, lawmakers need to see this, or so-and-so fill in the blank needs to see this. And it goes in all, you know, all elementary school students need to see this, or, you know, these kinds of things. And like Naomi said, that feeling of not only a personal connection, which is the main priority for me to create, is like whoever walks in, that they feel a visceral, sensual connection, that they build a relationship with the content first and foremost, that it's a salient experience that we're creating. And then from there, they're open to more narratives, more learning, that they're motivated to learn and engage more. And that may then involve engaging in a political process, or in the capacity that they have to make change of whatever sort that may be. Mm-hmm. So certainly I would love to get it closer to the halls of power in, you know, for the very reason that these are important matters, that we feel we have something to share that's really innate in the landscape itself. What's exciting to me about working with Naomi is that, you know, we are expressing a lot as directly as we can through, you know, we guide and curate the best means that we have available to us for people to receive this information, but the information is coming out of the landscape and out of the climate, et cetera. So
hey, Ethan, I don't know if you can see the Q&A. Scott, can you see the Q&A?
Got it.
There's one from Scott.
Okay, so, yeah.
Start there.
Sure, I'll just read the question to everyone. You know, could you talk about the process of converting science to art? How much do you need to understand to provide visual representation of the process, the processes and the results? You know, it's interesting. I don't have a science background. I have a background in fine art and in filmmaking. But I try to be a good listener. I try to filter as much as I can in a broad context through, you know, my own sets of, you know, frameworks. And the key to that really is being a lay person, and as I have conversations with Naomi, which start out as really hilarious, messy chicken scratch, many pages, like, you know, it just spread all over a table basically. And we distill down, you know, what are the moments of cognition around these complex ideas that are captured in images, or even in movement, or, you know, like kinetic sense, where it goes in through to like, okay, aha, I get what you're saying now. This is the way that appears, you know. And that's drawing then upon experiences of like, what doesn't does and does not work in terms of media and exhibition. And if you walk into a space, what will I notice? What will I be drawn to? What will engage me? What will hold my attention? What comes first? What comes second? Those kinds of things. So I'm always humbled by, you know, the magnitude of the just the sheer data and levels of understanding that I'm trying to climb into with her help, and she's very patient and gracious and with that. But I've been surprised that, you know, sometimes it's just a little twist on a perceptual knob, essentially, and there that captures what's going to help everybody else to understand it too. I hope that answers that question.
I was just going to add one thing to that, and Scott, kind of almost jumping to your other question. You know, one of the things that you can think about art and science that connects them is that it's always a matter of, both of them are ways to focus attention on particular things, right? My models don't represent all the complexity that's going on in the world. It would be overwhelming, right? Much of science is figuring out what to pay attention to. And, you know, I don't add complexity to my model, even though Jeff is talking about these feedbacks. I'm like not going there. I don't go there until I feel like there's a real, given the way I'm focusing my attention, it makes sense to do that. There's a certain amount of art in science, right? And some of that, you know, it's art that's confronted by data. It's confronted by understanding what field scientists are doing. But there's a focusing of attention that I do, right? That, you know, when I first started talking this through to Ethan, who, like you said, really didn't have background in this, a lot of the work was saying, well, why am I looking at this but ignoring that? And so that's a lot of what you're doing in models, and what we pay attention to comes, you know, from the scientific literature. It comes from the field experiments that we do, of the things we think are important. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to do sometimes, and I think we could do a better job with our future mountain, is telling certain stories, actually focusing people's attention. But if you think about it, that's what art does, right? Art is in part a way of saying, hey, pay attention to this, look at it this way, which you might not have done before. So there's kind of a natural tension, but also collaboration that comes because we're both struggling with how to do that.
Yeah, well said. By the way, I'm pasting into the chat just a page from the burncycleproject.com website that deals with our collaboration and Future Mountain in particular, if you guys want to see more images and video of that. And then there's other stuff on the website too that we often show that with.
David, your question about what are my biggest concerns about the models. I think I have two types of concerns, right? One are things uncertainties that I know are important that we just don't know enough about. One of those being like the subsurface. The other, Jeff will be happy for me to say, is that, you know, so many of these things that we're talking about in the Western US have to do with patterns of precipitation, how much water comes into the system. And it's still really hard. Like, we use data to drive our models, but our understanding of how things like precipitation and snow are distributed over the space is still, there's a lot of uncertainty there, and those uncertainties really matter. So it's kind of some of the inputs and some of the parameters that describe the subsurface, I think, are things that I don't worry about, but I you know, now I have to run over uncertainty, and it would be great to know more. I think the other thing I worry about is that there is so much science going on, and it's still hard to keep up with all of the pieces of science. And I think, you know, the way in which the peer review literature does that, or even synthesis papers do that, I worry that we miss a lot of new stuff. And I mean, I think this is a social problem. It's not just my problem, but how we make better use of all the scientific data out there, we're trying to address in a small way, but I think it's a real big problem. And then for people, you know, how to communicate this with people. It's you know, people have such different backgrounds, and you know, we live in a time of you know, we want this to be salient to a real broad community of people. So I think a lot of learning has to happen with not just the science, but really, like we say, how we communicate the science. Like, even if we're using Future Mountain, what are the games we can play? What are the scaffolding that we need to help people interact with this in a way that's going to actually make them enjoy what they're doing and learn something rather than just get frustrated?
Yeah, and to that, I would add that one of the next steps, you know, maybe version 3.0 of Future Mountain would be gamified. And I mean, it's actually built into a video game platform. We're using all these video game tools, and it's natural to start plugging in learning experiences that have a point system, what have you, that motivate people to progress through you know, an exploration in a particular way of the experience. And right now it's very open and a sort of a, what we call in the museum world, informal learning, which is sometimes the best kind of learning, because that's where you, like I was saying before, the kinds of personal relationships you make with content, rather than a sort of a top-down, you should learn this kind of experience. But I would add to what Naomi said also, that you know, fire, water, forests, all kinds of things in the sciences are ultimately really interesting to people. And if you can create something attractive that is a doorway into that, it's not hard to draw people in and add steps further into the content from there. So like I have said to people before, it's okay to say that fire is beautiful, you know, like, and it's okay to present something that is a sensory attraction around something that ultimately is complex and problematic, and people get that. It's okay. So I'm a real advocate for using beauty and using spectacle as a welcome sign in a way, so that it's not daunting to engage if you feel like you don't know about the science. That's one good reason among many to do something like that.
Awesome. Well, I really want to thank you both, and I really look forward to having you here in person sometime, and seeing this next iteration of Future Mountain. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's really so important to engage with people in different modalities, in different ways, to tap into their creative sides. And, you know, as Naomi said, you know, modeling is just so important for us to be able to think about the myriad of ways that things could be changing in the future that we can't predict right now. So it's a fantastic collaboration, and I appreciate you both being here, and thank you.
Thanks again, Carol, for inviting us. It's great.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Bye.